Modern life is deeply attracted to the idea of progress. In the 18th century, as European societies became ever richer and more technological, the conventional view was that mankind was firmly set on a positive trajectory from savagery and ignorance towards prosperity and civilization. But there was at least one 18th century philosopher who violently disagreed and who continues to have very provocative things to say to our own era. ژان-ژاک Rousseau was born to an educated watchmaker in Geneva in 1712. When he was 10, his father got into a legal dispute and the family was forced to flee Geneva. From that point on, Rousseau's life was marked by deep instability and isolation. As a young man, Rousseau went to Paris and there was exposed to the opulence and luxury that was the order of the day in Ancien Régime Paris. It was a far cry from his birthplace of Geneva, a city that was sober and deeply opposed to luxury goods. Then one day in 1749, he read a copy of a newspaper, the Mercure de France, that contained an advert for an essay on the subject of whether recent advances in the arts and sciences had contributed to what was called the purification of morals. In other words, was the world getting better? Rousseau experienced something of an epiphany. It struck him that civilization and progress had not, in fact, improved people. Instead, they had exacted a terrible, destructive influence on the morality of human beings who had once been good. Rousseau took this insight and turned it into the central thesis of what became his celebrated Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. His argument was simple. Individuals had once been good and happy, but as people had emerged from their pre-social state and joined society, they had become plagued by vice and sin. In this work, and in its twin, the Discourse on the Origins and Foundations of Inequality, Rousseau went on to sketch what it would have been like at the beginning of history, an idyllic period that he called the state of nature. A long time ago, when men and women lived in forests and had never entered a shop or read a newspaper, the philosopher pictured people more easily understanding their own minds and so being drawn towards essential features of a satisfied life, a love of family, a respect for nature, an awe at the beauty of the universe, a curiosity about others, and a taste for music and simple entertainments. The state of nature was moral and guided by spontaneous pity, empathy for others and their suffering. So what was it about civilization that Rousseau thought had corrupted people and led to moral degeneracy? Rousseau claimed that the march towards civilization had awakened in people an unhealthy form of self-love, amour-propre he called it, something that was artificial and centered around pride, jealousy and vanity. Rousseau argued that this destructive form of self-love had emerged as people had moved into cities and there had begun to compare themselves to others and created their identities solely by reference to their neighbours. Civilized people had stopped thinking about what they wanted and they felt and merely imitated other people, entering into ruinous competitions for status and money and losing sight of their own sensations. Rousseau is forever associated with the term noble savage because it was his work that described the innocence and morality of our ancestors and contrasted it with modern decadence. At the time Rousseau was writing, European society was fascinated by the plight of the native North American tribes. Reports of Indian society drawn up in the 16th century had once described the Indians as materially simple but psychologically very rich and interesting. Communities were small, close-knit, egalitarian, religious, playful and martial. However, within a few decades of the arrival of the Europeans, the status system of Indian society had been revolutionized through contact with the technology and luxury of European industry. Indians now longed for guns, alcohol, beads and mirrors. Rates of suicide and alcoholism had risen, communities were fracturing and factions were squabbling. The modern world had ruined the lives of people who had once lived happily in the state of nature. Rousseau's interest in natural goodness made him very interested in the idea, though not quite the reality, of children. In 1762 he wrote Émile, or On Education, perhaps the most successful book ever written about how to raise children. Rousseau suggested that children were born naturally good, and that the key to raising them was therefore always to prevent their corruption by society. This idea was widely influential. Parents who had before this time seen their children as wicked or at best as blank slates now viewed them as founts of wisdom and tried to give them a childhood full of play and visits to forests and lakes. Rousseau became the inventor of child-centered education. He was also a great proponent of breastfeeding, declaring, "Let mothers deign to nurse their children, and morals will reform themselves. Nature's sentiments will be awakened in every heart, and the state will be repeopled." It was, he knew, a bit of a hyperbole, but it spurred a wave of breastfeeding even among the wealthy who'd long disdained the practice. Artists rushed to paint and honour the new vogue for breastfeeding. Because Rousseau so closely valued human beings in their original state, it followed that in the novels he wrote, Rousseau also constantly celebrated intense feelings rather than great deeds or social events. In his novel Julie, written in 1761, Rousseau depicted the excitement and anguish of an upper-class woman caught in a love triangle between her sensitive tutor and her boring but socially sanctioned aristocratic match. Rousseau's contemporaries might have seen Julie as unwise and her feelings as a passing fancy, but Rousseau painted her love in a higher light. He urged us to see its grandeur, depth and honour. In his writings about his own life, Rousseau was similarly romantic, or what one might unkindly call self-absorbed. In his famous Confessions, one of the first ever autobiographies, Rousseau spent pages exploring his inner life, how frustrating he found shopping, the surprising feeling of tenderness for his ex's new partner, or the joys of gardening. To him, these weren't trivial or self-absorbed topics, they were part of an important task, to show what living is like on the inside. "I have conceived of a new genre of service to render to man," he boasted, "to offer them the faithful image of one amongst them, in order for them to learn to know themselves." Rousseau died in 1778, aged 66. His reputation has continued to grow. He was, from beyond the grave, one of the heroes of the French Revolution, and he became an icon to a great many artists and writers of the 19th century. Rousseau can be considered as one of the founding figures of what we now know as the Romantic movement, an ideology responsible for valuing the primitive over the civilized, the child over the adult, the passionate lover over the calmly loyal spouse. The modern world, despite its addiction to status, machinery, and capitalist values, in many ways continues to be profoundly romantic in its heart. It's astonishing that so much of what we take to be common sense or just natural can directly be traced back to the work of one not always wise, but always highly intriguing and provocative thinker.